welcome to Living One. I'm your host, Olivia Crossman. Living One is a monthly webinar series, now in its 5th year, in which presenters from around the world share their vision of a future where all Earth beings live as one community in peace, dignity, and freedom. We ask the question, we know what's wrong, but what does right look like? Today begins the 4th and last of our 2023 series, Contemplative Activism and Nonviolent Action. All radical and long-lasting social justice movements, such as the Indian Salt March and the American Civil Rights, are rooted in practices of contemplative activism, reflective of nature's principles and ethics of nonviolence. The 4 speakers in this series will reflect on their personal, transformative work and engagement in nonviolent action. Our guest today is Kim Stallwood. Kim is an author and independent scholar with more than 45 years of personal commitment as a vegan and professional experience in leadership positions with some of the world's leading animal rights organizations. He is a leader in preserving the history of the animal rights movement. The British Library in London acquired the Kim Stallwood Archive in 2020. Recht, the Zurich-based animal law organization, established the Kim Stallwood Collection in 2022. He is a member of the Culture and Animals Foundation Board of Directors and served as the volunteer executive director of Minding Animals International from 2012 to 2017. His book, Growl, was published by Lantern in 2014. He is a contributor to various academic anthologies. Currently, he's writing the biography of Topsy, the female Asian elephant electrocuted to death on Coney Island, New York in 1903. He holds dual UK and US citizenship and lives in England. But before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are all currently on various different Indigenous lands. I am currently on the ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, which includes the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. This land exists also as a place of trade with other Indigenous communities, including the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Menominee, Sauk, and Meskwaki. The Krulo Center for Nonviolence is located on the homelands of the grizzly bear, takelma, dakubedete, coyote, coho salmon, golden eagle, and gray wolf. Kim will be speaking for about 45 minutes, after which we will have 15 minutes for question and answer. Please keep your microphone muted to avoid any unintended interruptions throughout Kim's presentation. If you do have any questions for Kim, you can go ahead and type them into the chat, and we will read them out after his presentation. For anyone who isn't familiar with the Zoom chat function, if you move your cursor towards the bottom of your screen, you will see a number of icons appear, one of which is the chat function towards the center left of your screen. If you click on that, the chat will appear where you can type any questions or comments as we go. This Zoom session will be recorded, so if you would feel more comfortable leaving your camera off or changing your Zoom name, please do so. Finally, we ask that all of us participate with full respect and attention to each other in the spirit of peace and wisdom that Living One seeks to foster. So without further ado, we are very excited to welcome Kim Stallwood.
Thank you very much, Olivia, and thank you very much, Carolus, for inviting me to give this presentation. And I wanted to take a moment to remember Esther the pig who died a couple of days ago. And I know Esther reached a lot of people's lives in her work. And I'm speaking to you from England, and it's just coming out to the early evening now. And I'm going to have the moment that speakers dread, which is to try and make sure that I'm successful in sharing my screen and bringing up my presentation. And I'll speak through the presentation, and at the end, I'll take it down and you'll be able to see me, and we can deal with the questions and answers. So I'm going to share screen now. I'm going to do this. And I'm hoping that you can now see the presentation. And the theme of my presentation is understanding the past to see the future. And I hope this will become self-evident as we go through the presentation. I know that there's just been an introduction made about me, which I just wanted to reiterate here, that I work as an animal rights activist and theorist. I'm an independent author, scholar, and consultant. I became a vegan in 1976, and this was after I worked in a chicken slaughterhouse in 1973 when I became a vegetarian in 1974. And I've been involved with some of the world's foremost animal advocacy organizations in the UK, USA, and Europe. And today I work as an author, independent scholar, and consultant in animal rights. And I have three primary projects that is my focus right now. One is the Topsy, the elephant, writing her biography. The second is preserving animal rights history through various activities. And the third is serving on the volunteer board of the Culture and Animals Foundation. And the presentation I want to make today is in 5 parts. And the first is understanding my animal rights advocacy as a practice, the 4 key values in animal rights, preserving the history of the animal rights movement, and then how can we know where we want to go if we don't know where we came from? And then lastly, talking about Topsy the elephant and why this project links the past, present, and future together. So I hope that seems an interesting program of topics to talk about this evening. And I just want to try and do something on my screen where, yeah, that does it. So there is the cover of my book called Growl. And the first chapter in the talk this evening or this afternoon is understanding my animal rights advocacy as a practice. It took me quite a while to figure out that my animal rights advocacy was actually a practice. And a practice is the word is a verb to learn how to play a musical instrument, a noun to describe a conventional place of work. It's a discipline or engagement with a set of philosophical, spiritual, or moral ideas. And it took a while for me to figure out that my work as an animal rights advocate is a practice. It's something which I continuously learn how to hopefully do more effectively. And it's an embodied way of encapsulating the work that I do for animals. And as I wrote Growl and thought about it, I wanted to define what I felt were key values, the 4 key values in animal rights advocacy. And I concluded that they were compassion, truth, nonviolence, and justice. And it's these 4 key values that constitute my practice as an animal rights advocate. And I define my practice on a day-to-day basis as mainly self-education by reading and writing. These are integral to my advocacy. Now, in the past, I did more activities than reading and writing. I organized demonstrations, took part in many demonstrations, organized campaigns of various kinds. But really right now, my focus is on reading and writing, and that constitutes my form of advocacy, which I hope will become self-evident as I talk more about these projects. Okay, why isn't we going to, oh, here we go. So the 4 key values in animal rights, and I start with compassion, because compassion is for me the emotion that motivates me to want to be involved with animals. I feel compassion is the emotion rather than passion or sympathy or empathy, because compassion means to me that it's a way of connecting to what animals experience and to be motivated by that connection to want to help them. Sympathy doesn't really include the motivating factor. One can feel sympathy for someone else, but one isn't necessarily motivated to want to help them. One can feel pity for others, but again, we're not really motivated to do it. And we can feel empathy. We can put ourselves into the place of others. But what distinguishes me, compassion, from those other emotions is that an element of compassion is the connection, and that connection motivates us to want to help others, in my case, particularly animals. And then the second key value is truth, in that I want to tell the truth as I understand it and as I see it in our relationship with animals. And that's what advocacy is all about. That's what advocacy means to me, is that we are telling the truth. We're revealing the truth about what happens to animals, and quite often what happens to them is actually hidden in society. And then the third key value is nonviolence. And this is the value that I see in the relations we have with animals, because we want to end the violence that we do to animals, whether it's explicit or implicit. And then the fourth key value is a sense of justice, that this is our commitment to animals, that we give them justice. So these four key values could be taken individually, or they could be taken as a total group. And I try to make sure that all the work that I do for animal rights is based in these key values. Now, there are times when I have to admit I don't always feel compassionate towards other people. I'm a bit of a misanthrope at times, but I try to sort of keep that intact, in check. And in particular, because of the careless commitment to nonviolence, I wanted to just focus on nonviolence as one of these four key values. So what do I understand nonviolence to actually mean? For me, it means the exercise of power or influence to effect change without injury to the opponent. I know in the past there have been activities that I've been involved with animal rights which wouldn't meet this standard, if you like. So this could be demonstrating outside the home of someone who works in a research laboratory, or targeting someone in the public eye in a way that's particularly cruel or offensive. So those would be examples that I would now see as not meeting my definition of nonviolence. And the definition of nonviolent action. So they've got to be, these actions, to meet the standard of nonviolent action, they've got to be embed the four key values in them. So they've got to be compassionate, honest, nonviolent in themselves, and have a sense of justice. So conversely, I see violent actions are those that embody the opposite of the four key values: indifference, lies, violence, and injustice. And further speaking about nonviolence, no sentient being, regardless of species, deserves to be oppressed, exploited, or killed. This means that I'm proud to be an animal rights activist and not an animal lover who is against animal exploitation and for animal rights. This was a position that I held for a very long time, and I'll explain shortly why I changed and re-understood what I understood animal lover to actually mean. So when I was an animal rights activist and not an animal lover who is against animal exploitation and for animal rights, I was a very highly emotional and angry when I thought about animal exploitation. And my emotions were essentially directed towards an abstraction, which was the concept of the industrial use of animals, the commercial exploitation of animals, the exploitation of animals for profit and other material gain. But before I could feel compassion more deeply, I had to connect with my true self compassionately and stop the somewhat vicious cycle of self-righteousness that was wrapped up in my anger as an animal rights activist. And I learned that I was an animal rights activist and an animal lover. And for a long time, I did not see myself as an animal lover, and very much followed the writings of some philosophers who denigrated animal lovers as being people who basically abused animals. So I now see myself as an animal rights activist and an animal lover. So what made me realize loving animals was actually a good ethical place to be, and a good place to be as far as meeting the definition of nonviolence. And as Esther the pig had the impact with a lot of people, in my case, it was a giant chihuahua called Booba, and there he is. And Booba adopted me. He stormed into my life in 1989, biting, barking, and snapping at my ankles. And we were made for each other, but he adopted me. And he, I lived with cats. I shared a flat in London where we had a lot of cats, but never really lived with a dog. And this dog, Booba, taught me about the magical connection that exists between humans and animals. And he taught me what it really meant to be loving of animals. And I saw the magical connection as an altruistic love and realized animal rights is about building magical connections between all sentient beings, regardless of their species. So this little dog who bit and barked and snapped taught me how to actually love others. He adopted me and I was adopted by him, and he meant a great deal to me because he made me see that being involved with animal rights was more than just an ethical abstraction. It was a powerful emotional feeling. So Buber led me to the path of discovering my 4 key values in animal rights: compassion, truth, nonviolence, and justice. So the third section in my presentation is about preserving the history of the animal rights movement. And here I am photographed in an office that I used to have, not the current one I have now. But here you can see some of the 2,000 plus books on animal rights and related matters that I have. And ever since the first days of becoming a vegetarian, then becoming vegan, and then starting to work full time for animal organizations, for reasons I've never really understood, I just collected campaign materials. In part, I think it was because I used them as a resource to help me with my organizing, but there was no sort of vision that I had that I was embarking upon collecting and building a library and archive. But I collected this stuff and it just kept adding to it and adding to it. And in the result of sort of four decades of being involved with animal rights in various roles and capacities, I created this very large collection. And the books are part of that collection. And this archive came to sort of represent in a tangible way my life in animal rights, not only as a repository of knowledge and insights from which I draw for my work and writing, but as a reminder that animal advocacy didn't start when I became a vegetarian. I learned that there was a history that predated my involvement. I know that when I first became involved as an arrogant young man, I thought animal rights began when I discovered it. But it took me a while to discover that I was actually quite wrong on that, and that there was a lot of activism that preceded my involvement. So the collection grew and grew, and grew in particularly when for 20 years I lived in the United States. There was also a parallel building of a collection, which I want to talk about here now. And Joel Knopf, who's present here listening to me, he played a very large role in helping me do this work. So in 1993, I became the editor-in-chief of the Animals Agenda magazine, which some of you may remember and subscribe to. And it was published by an organization called the Animal Rights Network. And in producing the Animals Agenda magazine, we actively solicited material from organizations. And in some cases, we actually worked with organizations where we took on the responsibility of their archives, and their archives left their offices and came to the offices that we had for the magazine in Baltimore, Maryland. But in 2002, we had to stop publishing the Animals Agenda for various reasons, which I can go into in the Q&A. And we merged with an organization called Psychologists for the Ethical Treatment of Animals to form the Animals and Society Institute, which I'm very pleased to say continues to be actively working today. And also around that time, I began to work with the philosopher Tom Reagan with the Culture and Animals Foundation. And he retired as a philosopher from North Carolina State University, where he taught philosophy for 34 years. and the NCSU established the Tom Regan Animal Rights Library as a special collection. And the Animal Society Institute partnered with the Culture and Animals Foundation to help organize for about 9 years an annual conference called the Compassionate Living Festival, where we invited speakers to come in and address the participants there. So there was a dilemma that I was faced, which is that we were merging organizations, ending the Animals Agenda magazine, and in my office I had a very large second collection of materials in addition to my own personal collection. And this second collection was included the archives from the Animal Welfare Institute. It also included a collection of more than 1,000 titles to do with cats that was collected by a retired author of cat books, whose name was Claire Necker. And we also acquired her collection of cat collectibles. And I forget exactly how many collectibles there were, but everything that you can imagine that appeared on a cat, the cat's appearance would appear on, from objects to tea towels to works of art. If it had a cat on it, Claire collected it, and all those collectibles were saved into our office. And very fortunately, Tom Regan and I were able to work with the North Carolina State University Library, the Special Collections Department. They acquired all the various collections that I had secured as I published the Animals Agenda magazine. And they included the Argus Archives, which was a New York-based organization that collected footage of animals and documentaries about animals, and the Animal Welfare Institute Archives, which was a long-standing organization formed in the early 1950s that campaigned on many issues, and then the Claire Necker collection of cat books and collectibles, as well as the Animals Agenda's archives of our own. And all of those materials were taken to North Carolina, to Raleigh, North Carolina, and they are now part of the Tom Regan Animal Rights Archive at NC State University. So it was important that NCSU became, in the United States, the first real major collection to do with animal rights. And I'm very proud to have been involved in that work. And it took a lot of effort, and Joel Knopf will know how much work that required, because he played a major role in helping us do it. And I'm pleased to see that subsequently, the ASPCA, the HSUS, and Feminists for Animal Rights, all their archives have also been acquired by NCSU and have gone into the Tom Regan Animal Rights Archive. So it's really a major depository of materials of various kinds to do with animal rights. And it's also begun to acquire personal archives from leading campaigners, Bernard Unti, who's with the Humane Society of the United States, and Wim de Kock, who's with whose history been involved with various global animal projects. Their archives have also gone into NCSU. So NCSU, with its Tom Regan Animal Rights Archive, has established itself globally as a key player in having one of the world's largest collections of materials about animal ethics, animal advocacy, and the moral legal status of animals. And that archive is being used by academics and scholars and students. Now, the next part about preserving the history of the animal rights movement is that when I returned to the UK in 2007, after 20 years of living and working in the USA, I had to deal with my own personal collection. And my own personal collection had grown so large that we had to rent a shipping container to bring it back to the UK. And it provoked quite a challenge to me to figure out what I was going to do with it. And as one gets older, one's got to make decisions about what do we do with all these materials and all these things that we've acquired over the years. And I approached the British Library with an expression of interest. Were they interested in talking to me and learning about animal rights and seeing if they were interested in the collection that I had acquired? And I had all this collection in an office where I now work, where my office now is. And on the left, where you see that picture of me, that's rare picture of me smiling, there's the Kim Stallwood Animal Rights Collection. That's the cover of a book that I produced to use when I had my first meeting with the British Library. So I'm showing up at the British Library, never having met any of these people before, but having been introduced to them by a scholar who was involved with animal studies, who kindly introduced me to them. I thought, what am I going to do to try to convince them that I was a credible person, that I had a very large collection of materials, and that animal rights was a subject which was worthy of the British Library being interested in. And just to help place an understanding as to what the British Library is, it's essentially the equivalent of the US Library of Congress. The British Library is the UK's national library. There are various libraries in Scotland and in Wales, but the British Library is the British Library. And so I wanted to start at the top, as it were, to see if I could persuade them to take my collection of materials. And through a long series of discussions and meetings where they would come down to Hastings from London, where I live, where my office is, to see the materials, we eventually agreed that what they would do was to take my research materials. And these were 36 boxes of research materials. I wanted the British Library to take everything as one whole collection, but they weren't interested in everything. But what they were interested in was research materials. So in 2020, 36 boxes of research materials were acquired by the British Library, and they are now stored and catalogued by them as the Kim Stallwood Archive. And so the research materials were a series of files, old laptops, and diaries and address books. And they are being used. I've heard from one academic from Australia who was in London and went to the British Library and looked at those materials for his research project. And then I had then to the challenge of what else do I do with the rest of the materials? And I'm going to come back to this in a little bit further, more fuller, but basically I then discovered an organization called Recht in Zurich, Switzerland. And in 2022, they acquired 200 boxes of miscellaneous materials from me, which included a lot of other materials from my collection, plus also another collection that I had rescued from an individual who had been working undercover in animal research laboratories. So this leaves in my office 2,000 plus books as my library, which I kept back because I actually do use them in the projects that I'm working on at the moment. So I've been able to get, in addition to North Carolina and the Reagan Archive, the Kim Stallwood Archive at the British Library, and my collection at Recht. And this is a photograph of the archivist from the British Library working in my office and looking through the boxes of materials. I just want to say a little bit more about what they acquired. And it was 600 organizational files, 150 people files, and 118 subject files. So these are files that I'd created over the decades, whereby I stored and collected material. And these files included meeting notes from various meetings, correspondence, publications, and material that had been given to me by either the organizations or the people. And the subject files were files that I created whereby they were press clippings or publications. And I broke the subject files down into various categories like animals in agriculture, animals in research. And these were working files that I used and referred to in the various projects that I worked on. And what the British Library liked about them was that there was a uniqueness about them, that they encapsulated a period of time, and that they were actual working files. They were research files. The library also took my appointment diaries and address books over a couple of decades, because they were documents that I used that were real research materials. They were things that scholars can look at to see what activities were going on and can match up with the various files. They also took 2 old laptops, which they're downloading to store what's called born digital files. So as we have paper files, we now increasingly have born digital files. So these are files that are actually created on a computer, and that's why they took the 2 old laptops. And this is a photograph of Jonathan Pledge, the British Library archivist, who I worked very closely with on the acquisition of the materials. And it was quite a long process, because they wanted to make sure that the material met the standards of what they were looking for to acquire, and that he had to make a presentation to a committee that he reports to justify the library's acquisition of these materials. So he had to do a lot of research and documenting of this. And as a result of the British Library's acquisition of these materials, this past year, they have been very active in taking further steps to augment the acquisition of the archive. So in last year, an oral historian came to my office over a series of visits and recorded 10 hours of interviews with me, whereby I was asked questions about my involvement with animal rights, my upbringing, what my opinions were. And this oral history is part of a group of oral histories that the British Library maintain. I was invited to write 4 guest posts for the British Library's social science blog, and those guest posts, which are still up and still able to be read, I wrote them based around various themes to do with animals, and I focused upon books that I felt that were key texts in the various topics. Those animals and feminism, animals and the climate crisis, animals and social justice, for example. And they then also organized an exhibit that was in the Treasures Gallery of the British Library. I don't know if any of you have had an opportunity to go to the British Library, but the Treasures Gallery is their main exhibit area. And this is the where they keep their treasures, so on display. So this is things like everything that's from copies of the Bible to Shakespeare folios to handwritten lyrics by Paul McCartney, etc., etc. And they put on a small exhibit to do with animal rights, which they called From the Margins to the Mainstream, Animal Rights in Britain. And this was in the Treasures Gallery. And I spent a couple of days there and watched people going around the Treasures Gallery and also looking at this animal rights exhibit. And the photograph on the right is one item that was on display in the glass cabinets, and this was credited as coming from my archive. And this was produced in the late 1970s, hand-drawn, handwritten, a poster that was given out to activists. And it always amuses me because in the bottom left-hand corner, it says, "So you want to really help animals? There are lots of ways. Unfortunately, they're all illegal." So that very much spoke to the activism at that time. it says also, animal activists are committed to action. The thought is not enough. And then the British Library also hosted a public meeting, the Fight for Animal Rights, Kim Stallwood in Conversation, which was with me, chaired by the archivist, and we had an animal studies scholar and an animal lawyer also on the panel. And we talked about the archive and the history of the importance of preservation. And all this took part in parallel with a major exhibit which the British Library had, which wasn't directly to do with animal rights, but it was animals, art, science, and sound. And it was a fabulous collection of material, books, posters, photographs, records, long-playing records, whereby various people had documented various ways the natural history of animals. So this is important for me to say that the reason why it's important to preserve the history is because it's to make it accessible to others to use in the future. And if we don't look after our own history, someone else will look after it, and they perhaps won't be so kind or accurate about the history as we are about our own. So this leads me to my involvement with TIR and Recht in Zurich. And once I realized that the British Library wasn't going to take everything, I had to then find someone else who would take everything else. And I've known that animal organizations have their own libraries, which vary in size and ability. And for some of them, it's just a bookcase in the corner of someone's office. But when I stumbled across TIR and Recht and discovered this photograph on their website, I thought, this looks to be an organization that takes its library seriously. And quite soon after discovering them, I was scheduled to speak at a conference in Sweden. And whilst I was at that conference, I wondered if anyone from TIR and Recht would be also there. And luckily, someone was there from TIR and Recht. And I introduced myself to them and started a conversation with them, which eventually led to the agreement whereby they took the rest of my collection. So this is a photograph of their library. It's just a small selection of what they've got. The lady in the ochre dress on the right-hand side, she is TIR and Recht's full-time librarian. She's super qualified, and she's also a professional archivist who only uses vegan materials to preserve books commercially for clients that she has separately from TIR and Recht. And it's a fabulously run library. I'm very impressed by it, and they use it for their work, which I want to say something briefly about. So TIR and Recht, which roughly translates as Foundation for the Animal in the Law, was founded in Zurich, Switzerland in 1995 with a mission to improve human-animal relationships in legal, ethical, and social sense. And they do various scientific and academic work. They critique existing laws, promote new legislation, and their goals are to eliminate deficiencies in legislation and ensure consistent implementation. And they campaign politically to enforce laws and regulations. So they are like a animal rights think tank focused on the law. They're a bit like Animal Legal Defense Fund in the United States. They're a bit like the law departments, which are now opening up in law schools and universities around the United States and in other countries. But they are an independent charity, and they use their library as part of their work to advance the moral and legal status of animals in the law. And I was very excited to see that their specialized library had more than 20,000 publications on animals in law, ethics, and society. And they took their library very seriously. They look after it very professionally. It's a very impressive collection. It's very impressively run. And it's the largest collection of human-animal relations in German-speaking area. They have material in English, German, French, and Italian. And also the Swiss Library Service Platform, which is the service provider for the whole of the country for libraries to network on a national library platform, that they've been approved to join the Swiss Library Service Platform. So in the course of time, and they're working on this now, the database which documents or inventories the contents of the Recht library, that database will be accessible to anyone in Switzerland through the Swiss Library Service Platform. So again, this is more than just, oh, let's just save all these old publications. These are very, very much saving them and proactively making them available to scholars, academics, students, public policymakers, and so on. And this photograph shows a room that is specially dedicated to my collection. They're still processing the materials, but you can see on the shelves behind myself and Moina, who is the professional librarian, archival quality boxes. And I can assure you that the materials are being properly preserved in archival quality tissue paper boxes. There's a lot of photographs, transparencies, reel-to-reel footage. On the table behind me is an old collecting box, which we acquired from the collection of the individual who worked undercover in a lot of research laboratories. So we have a lot of objects. And on the table we're looking at, there's a framed photograph that I took in the late 1970s of a woman burning a fur coat on Oxford Street in London. You can see there's some badges or buttons in little plastic bags. And there's that famous little book with me on the cover that I produced for the to convince the British Library that they should take my collection. So the Recht is seriously archiving my collection and this other collection that I acquired, and putting it to archival quality materials and making it available as part of their entire library. And I am actively talking to organizations and individuals in this country who are having to make decisions about their own collections and trying to advise them as to whether it's possible for the British Library to take them. And if the British Library isn't interested, then we talk to Recht to take them. And then lastly, in this section, the Moina at Recht set up something called the Animal Libraries Network, which is a website which connects 8 private and public libraries in Switzerland, Germany, and the USA that deal with animals, the environment, and vegetarianism. So this includes NCSU's Tom Reagan Animal Rights Archive. And this is a way of building a global network of libraries whose focus is on animals and related matters. Not every one of these libraries has the same animal rights ideology as Recht does, but they have an interest in animals, and it's a very useful network whereby scholars can access material that if it's not in one library, it could be possibly in another library in another country. And I encourage you to sort of go to that website and have a look at it. So this leads me to the fourth section, which is basically, how can we know where we want to go if we don't know where we came from? And the often quoted Santayana philosopher, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And the infamous vegan Kim Stallwood rewrites it as, those who cannot remember the animal rights past are condemned to repeat the mistakes of animal activists who came before them. And it's just a plea, really, that we really must preserve the history of the movement, and we really should learn what that history is, because often as I know I was guilty of, that when I first got involved, I had no understanding, no knowledge of what preceded me as far as animal rights advocacy or animal welfare advocacy. That there's a rich history that precedes my involvement and everyone else's involvement. And we can learn from that history. I was giving a talk to the staff of an organization recently, a vegan advocacy organization. And I was talking about them, about various chapters in the history of animal rights. And many of them did not know anything about the things I was talking about. So, for example, there is a fascinating story of what's known as the Old Brown Dog statue in London, whereby in the early 1900s, anti-vivisectionists and medical students fought over a statue of a dog who was erected to commemorate a real dog who was experimented on at London University. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the story of the Old Brown Dog, but the staff of this organization, I don't think anyone was familiar with the story of the Old Brown Dog. And we can learn from the sequence of events to do with the Old Brown Dog and other episodes like that as to what happened, so that it informs us as to what we can do today. And then just a sort of quick recap before we come to the last section. I've talked about understanding my rights advocacy as a practice, the 4 key values in animal rights, which are compassion, truth, non-violence, and justice, preserving the history of the animal rights movement with the archive of the British Library and my collection at Recht, and how it's important to know where we came from to know where we want to go. And a specific example of this is the project involved in writing the biography of Topsy the elephant. Topsy was a female Asian elephant who was put to death at Luna Park, one of America's first amusement parks on Coney Island, New York, on January 4th, 1903. She was fed carrots laced with 460 grams of potassium cyanide, and she was killed by 6,600 volts of electricity in front of a paying audience of 1,000+ people. And if anyone knows anything about Topsy, it's because they've heard or seen the film of her electrocution. The film was made by the Edison Manufacturing Company, and it's called Electrocuting an Elephant, and it is available to watch on YouTube. I'm not going to show it today. And you can go onto YouTube and watch it yourself. But it's attracted more than 1.4 million views. And if anyone knows anything about Topsy, it's because they saw or heard about that film. And I saw this film in the early 1980s, and then again about 10, 12 years later. And it has stuck with me because it's a particularly gruesome film to watch. Very distressing thing to watch, an incomprehensible thing as to why it happened in the first place. And I wanted to honor Topsy, and I wanted to do something for her. And I wanted to eventually realize that what I wanted to do was write her biography. I wanted to write her story. And I then become fascinated with the whole thing about animal biography and how can I tell her story and situate it in as an event in the past, and what relevance does it have to the conditions of elephants today and in the future. So my theme is understanding the past to see the future. And my goal in writing her biography is to link the past, present, and future with our relationship with elephants and animals generally. Now, it sounds unforgivable that someone would electrocute an elephant in 1903. And it sounds impossible that something would happen like that to elephants today. But I'm happy to tell you that elephants are electrocuted to death today in India, and deliberately so. And so in telling her story, I want to be able to answer questions like, why kill an elephant? Why film her electrocution? and what would happen to Topsy if she were alive today. And in answering those questions, I'm writing her biography in 3 voices. Her own voice, I'm imagining her own voice. And so as people read it, read this book, they will read what I imagine her voice, what she's saying. 3rd person investigative reporting, and then my own commentary about the story. So a combination of these voices, I hope, will paint a very deep and rich history of what happened and why it's relevant to today. And this is how I'm trying to use an episode of the past to question how are we treating elephants today and animals more generally today, and what would happen to Topsy if she were alive today. And this is being very cautious about what imagery I'm using to tell her story. And I don't want to sensationalize the story by using stills from the footage of her electrocution. But I am settling on using one image, which is an illustration from 1902 from the St. Paul Globe newspaper, which shows her wearing a martingale harness to restrain the movement of her head. And this was put on her after she killed a spectator called James Blount in Brooklyn, New York. And she was electrocuted to death in January 1903. So from this point on, she had 6-7 months to live. And I find this illustration really quite moving and emblematic of her. So here I've gone through the 5 chapters, if you like, in this presentation, and I hope that has been interesting and helpful and illuminating for you. And please be in touch with me. Please follow me. There's my website, which is kimstallwood.com. And if you want to help me with Topsy, there's a Patreon page. And I'm posting more of my writings on my Substack page. And with that, I don't know how long I've been talking, but what I'm going to try and do now is to stop share and turn the camera back on. And happy to answer any questions or hear any comments that you have to make.
Thank you so much, Kim. That was incredible and so informative and inspiring to hear your entire arc, and that library just sounds unbelievable. So I know there have been questions rolling in the entire time, so I'll jump in to read those out. Our first comment is from Marion. I believe they say, so glad you mentioned Esther. Esther and her dad's and all at HEEFS have done so much good. Thank you for your comment, Marion. I'm not sure if there's anything else you'd like to say about that, Kim, before we move to the next question, but
no.
Our next question from Douglas is wondering if you could please explain a bit more about how Buba gave or helped you to arrive at a deeper understanding.
Well, he was the first dog who came into my life and lived with me. I had lived with cats, and cats can be intimate and affectionate, and but they can also be quite standoffish and look upon you very begrudgingly. And I never had a cat who had a deep relationship with. I had good relationships with them, and we tolerated each other. But Buba was completely different. He was very dependent upon me, and I could realize that, and because he was a Chihuahua with an attitude. And I was working in the offices at PETA at that time, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. I had to be very conscious that I had to protect people from Buba. So if someone wanted to come and see me in my office, they had to call me in advance and tell me that they were on their way to come and see me, and they would wait outside whilst I picked Buba up and held him to allow them to come into my office and sit down in a chair. If they had just walked straight into my office, he would have rushed out from underneath my desk and bitten them, attacked them. So he taught me that looking after a chihuahua was far more complicated than just looking after a cat. And it was really that experience that led me to have that sort of deeper understanding of a relationship with someone else who wasn't human. And he had many other endearing qualities. He was a very handsome dog, but people did live in fear of him, and he would bite me, and I just thought he was wonderful. And he taught me that yes, of course, I love the cats who I lived with, but he taught me that love also could be very different. I don't know if that really helps to answer the question, but that was the experience that I had.
Beautiful. Sounds like quite the individual. Our next question is from Kathy, and if anyone else here still has any questions or comments that they'd like to share, go ahead and type those in, and we will get to them in just a minute. But Kathy is shared, I wonder if Kim might be able to talk about roadkill, especially of native animals, especially how native animals are an expression and connection to our environment, and changes in their behavior are early warning signs of changes in our environment. For example, beaching of whales or a marked increase of roadkill of a native species. And related to that, I would like to hear what Kim has to say about duty of care when an animal is injured on the road.
I have to say this is an area that I've not had much experience in, and unfortunately not had had to deal with situations like this. I do know that many activists, when they do see dead animals in a road, that they will stop and pull the animal out from the road and put them to the side of the road. I don't agree with people who think that roadkill is something that is eligible to eat. I know with development of the countryside, we're taking away their homes, their habitats, but we see it as a irritation that they cross the roads and get in the way. I'm sorry, I really don't have very much else to add to that. There's not an area that I've had much experience in, and fortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. Jaleel, I'm so sorry if I mispronounced your name, but is wondering, Jaleel, great, thank you. I like how you mentioned animal protection as a practice, as I think of practice, which it's used in the field of social work, medicine, and law, and how ultimately means one will make mistakes, but it's important to consistently work on improving and learning. But a question would be, how does your work intersect with other social justice protection movements?
I embrace the idea that animal rights is a social justice issue, which is part of a network of social justice issues. I'm not someone who subscribes to the view that that animal rights is the only important social justice movement, and doesn't care about other social justice issues, because I do care about other social justice issues, and part of the understanding that I've grown to develop over time is seeing animal rights as a interdependent social justice issue with other social justice issues, and I've been very much influenced by ecofeminist writers who have talked about, like Harriet Adams has talked about the intersection of oppressions, so I'm very concerned about the environment, and personally, with my partner, we try to live as environmentally friendly as we can. We try to grow our own, as much of our own vegetables as we can in a garden allotment that we keep, I try to also write and speak in pointing out the relationship of other social justice issues. There is a part of Growl in which I talk about how I wanted to speak honestly to people about what I saw was wrong with our relationship with animals, and I realized that that then, as a closeted gay man, that I had to be honest with myself and tell other people, or let it be known that I was a gay man involved with other social justice issues. But really, the focus of my life has been in animal rights. I've not gotten involved in a major way with other social justice issues over time. My focus has really been on animal rights. I hope that answers the question for you.
Beautiful, Kim. Thank you. And our last question so far is from Joel, is wondering, Kim, could you give us some verbal thumbnails of the important interviews you have done, their significance to you and to the animal rights movement?
Okay, thank you, Joel. Well, the first one that immediately comes to mind is the interview with Paul McCartney, which I did with my colleague Jill Howard Church. And he invited us. He did subscribe to the Animals Agenda magazine, and he did invite us to come to London to interview him a little while after his wife Linda had died. And we did come to London and do the interview. He was very he seemed very ordinary, very used to dealing with people who were doing interviews. He's how many decades has he been being interviewed by people? And he was very pleasant, very friendly. There was a funny moment where we ended up talking about leather, and he said that he didn't buy leather shoes, and he took off his shoe and sniffed it and waved it at us and said, this is a shoe that we buy from Vegetarian Shoes, which is a shop in Brighton. And he said, these shoes have been around the world several times and they're still very comfortable, and I don't wear leather. And at that moment, it felt like I was just talking to anyone, who is a vegan animal rights person, as opposed to someone like as famous as Paul McCartney. And I've also interviewed Peter Singer on a couple of occasions. And my relationship with Singer and his writings has changed over time. In the 70s and 80s, I very much bought into what Singer wrote, and his utilitarian philosophy and his books spoke for me, and they articulated for me what I thought I was thinking about animal rights. But then I was fortunate to get to know people like Tom Reagan, and to hear him speak several times and have discussions with him and read his books, and grew to understand the rights view and his criticism of utilitarianism. And then subsequent to that, I went through a similar process with Carol Adams and understanding ecofeminism, having conversations with her, and understanding the ecofeminist critique of the rights view and the utilitarian points of view, that these are all extensions of patriarchy, and that ecofeminism puts animals within a network of issues to be concerned about, and the intersection of oppression that I referred to. And just prior to today, I just been listening to a talk by Martha Nussbaum, who is a prominent lawyer and has written about animal rights. And that was interesting because she has her own take on what she sees as an ethical concern for animals. Another person I'll come to mind is Sue Coe, the artist, who I've got to know quite well and done various projects with her, and talking with her about her work and how she sees animal rights as an issue on the left, and part of a problem to do with capitalism and exploitation of people, animals, and the environment.
Wonderful. That's great. And for those of you who haven't come to Living One before, we often will post a series of resources from our speakers as well after the fact with the YouTube recording. So Kim, we can connect and get some of those thumbnails posted for you all to visit afterwards as well. Mike McCoy is wondering, how do you feel about supporting hunting as a reason to support so-called game and fish departments to protect wildlife?
Oh, I don't support it at all. I cannot see any justification for killing animals. So no, I don't see a justification for it at all.
Yeah. Thanks, Kim. Jaleel is wondering, is the status of animals today where you expected it would be when you started out? I ask as I often wonder about the future and where I would like or think their status and or rights might look like in the future.
I don't think I had any real understanding of what the future would be like, other than a general notion that one day the animals wouldn't be abused and that they would have rights. I have mixed feelings in the sense that I'm disappointed that we haven't made more progress than what we have made in nearly 50 years that I've been involved with it. But on the other hand, 50 years is not really a very long amount of time, and that there is definitely progress to report. Going back to the point about knowing the past in order to understand the present and know where the future is, I do see animal organizations stuck or locked into a pattern of behavior and advocacy which isn't necessarily getting us any further forward. I see animal groups doing a lot of good work, rescuing animals and saving animals, and a lot of, as it were, ambulance chasing, and a lot of protesting, a lot of outreach, public education. But I don't see us as a movement becoming a sophisticated social justice movement that understands animal rights as a mainstream political issue. And this is a big deficiency that I identify with us. And by saying that it should be a mainstream political issue, I think that animal rights needs to be elevated so that it stands alongside issues to do with environmental protection, the status of health and food production. So on the one hand, we talk personally and individually about the benefits of being vegan, but we don't really get into issues as much as I think we should, which should be things like arguing that government subsidies of animal agriculture should be withdrawn and that meat should be taxed. We don't really get into those kinds of arguments as much as I think as we should.
Mhm. Mhm.
And until we do that, and until political parties and the governments that they form, until they see the issues in that way, I don't think they're going to pay a great deal of attention to it, other than deal with peripheral issues, which are easy hanging fruit issues for them to deal with and respond to.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Kim. That's the end of our list of questions here in the chat. If anyone has any final questions before we wrap up, you can go ahead and type those in now. Otherwise, we can wrap up. We'll leave a couple seconds here if anyone pops another question in the chat.
Maybe I could ask, does anyone disagree with anything that I've said?
Looks like a pretty unanimous response. Oh, Jenny's written something. Given the name of your talk, are there a couple of books you highly recommend, especially as we look at the issue for our future, as the future of animals and humans are intertwined? Thanks for all you have done for animal rights and documenting the history.
Thank you. Books to recommend. There are so many good books out there. It's unbelievable. Let me start with one novel that I think is incredible, and it's by an Indian author whose last name is Narayan, which maybe I can put this into chat.
Absolutely, and you can email it to me as well, and we'll put it, link it with the YouTube video when we post that.
R.K. Narayan, and it's The Tiger of Malgudi. And what is so brilliant about this novel is that there are two major characters in the story. One is a tiger, and the other is a holy man who rescues the tiger. And the narrative voice of the novel switches seamlessly between the two of them. And I find it a very moving book. There's another called Zoopolis, which is not a novel, but I think that Zoopolis, which is by Kimlicka and Donaldson, and it's a fascinating assessment of the animal rights movement to date, and advocates a argument for a political understanding of animal rights. I don't necessarily buy into everything that they say, but I find the book really provocative and helpful. I'll leave it at those two, but people can email me privately, and I'll be happy to recommend others. And if you go to my website, there's a whole section of book reviews that I've posted of various types of books there.
That's great. That is a great start for a reading list, and we can post those with the YouTube as well as the link to your website, so people can find all of these excellent resources to continue the learning. But if that's everybody's questions, we can wrap up. And Kim, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your time with us. It's been incredible to hear about your work and all the documenting you've done for this movement. And it's really invaluable to spend this time with you. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak. It's been a great honor.
Absolutely. For everyone who's here, our next speaker in the series will be a week from today, Friday, October 27th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. We hope you'll all join us again. It's lovely to see some new faces here. And next week, we will be joined by Jim Torchiner, a recently retired professor of social work at McGill University and founder of the McGill Middle East program in civil society and peace building, as well as Project Genesis, a grassroots nonprofit community organization that empowers people from diverse backgrounds to advocate for entitlements, to change social policy, and to develop alternative community organizations. As always, if you enjoy Living One and you feel called to support Carrillo's Living One and all of our sanctuary residents, please consider donating at the link in our bio and on our website, carrillos.org. Once again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kim, and everyone who joined us today for your time and your energy and your participation. It's wonderful to be here with everyone, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.